Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Darren Daraj, and I am your 2025 Healthcare Leaders of New York Chapter President. Thank you for joining us this morning on the first of many executive series, Coffee with Our Chiefs, speaking to our senior leader voices related to topics and discussions to help continue to advance our development even at the senior and executive levels. I'm so excited to have the first topic be presented by an incredible regent for ACHE and for our district. Our presentation today will be navigating the executive search from candidate to contender. This will be presented by our regent and president and chief transformation officer of One Brooklyn Health, Mr. Arthur Gianelli. This is a 1.0 qualified education credit. It's self-reported. And next slide. Healthcare Leaders of New York is one of the largest chapters of the American College of Healthcare Executives. Our focus and mission is to help you, healthcare professionals within the metropolitan New York region, continue to advance in your careers towards success. That helps us to drive our pillars of education, service, professional development, network, advancement, and so much more. Your chapter is here for you, and together we are our market, our leadership, Healthcare Leaders of New York. Without further ado, I do want to move quickly into the presentation because we are all here for this incredible conversation, learning from experience as it relates to continuing to transform our careers and advance the work every single day. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Arthur Gianelli. And we're going to change the slides now.
Darren, you're too generous. Thank you and good morning. Let me share my slides here. So hold on, folks, while I try to navigate that, and then we'll start. Hold on. Hold on, folks. All right, does everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Art Gianelli. I'm President and Chief Transformation Officer at One Brooklyn Health. I previously worked for about 11 years in senior leadership roles at the Mount Sinai Health System. And prior to that, I ran the Nassau Healthcare Corporation out on Long Island. As Darren noted, I'm also the elected regent for the New York metropolitan area, representing you to the American College of Healthcare Executives. So I'm very happy to be here to discuss this topic, navigating the executive search from candidate to contender. Now, I've had a pretty lengthy career, and I will be honest with you, I participated in numerous searches, and I've been successful in precisely one. But it really, in the end, you only have to be successful, once in order to be able to advance your career. And that instance in my case was successfully securing the position here at One Brooklyn Health. So, what I want to try to do is convey to you, just some of my observations about the process as I've been involved in this process on numerous occasions throughout my career, and some tips and some traps associated with, again, navigating the executive search. So our learning objectives today, we're going to look to understand the hospital executive recruitment landscape. I want to give you some thoughts about how to position yourself effectively, give you some recommendations about, how I think you can excel in interviews and in follow-on assessments. Give you some pointers about navigating offers and negotiating, and then how to be successful when you start the job. What do those first 90 days look like? So a little bit about the executive search landscape. So first, retained search firms dominate the senior healthcare hiring. I'm going to define what a retained search firm is in a subsequent slide, so I'll hold that for now. But it's important to know that. And the retained search firms are firms like Korn Ferry and Whitkeefer, and more regionally Tal Healthcare as examples. The focus roles are the ones you would think they would be: CEO, COO, CNO, CFO, CMO, Chief Human Resources Officer. I can add into that, your CIOs as well, and your VPs also. I mean, it runs the gamut. Most of these searches at this point in time emphasize transformational leadership and how what you can do and what you bring to the table aligns with the mission of the organization and what the organization to which you're applying is looking to do in the next 1, 3, 5 years. Now, the last point I want to make, I think, is the most important, which is a level setting point, which is that the market right now, and I think the market for the foreseeable future for high-level positions in hospitals and health systems is extremely, extremely difficult. There is significant industry consolidation that's occurring. The economy is unsteady. I was listening to the news on the way in. 70% of Americans think that the country is on the wrong track, and that's been a consistent view on the part of Americans, certainly since the pandemic, and that starts to bleed into the competitive landscape for different industries. And in healthcare, where you're seeing significant margin pressure, right, and tremendous industry consolidation, what ends up happening is that the first positions that get looked at and eliminated are high-level administrative or executive positions in health systems. All right, so less positions available, so many more people are competing for them, and that's actually another important point there as well. That competing for positions is effectively frictionless, right? The application process is easy. You can send your resume and your cover letters to numerous positions all at the same time, and that doesn't really cost you anything. All right, so the number of people hiring, the number of people applying for positions that organizations are hiring for, those very few positions are tremendous. I can give you a quick example. We have a position posted for Chief Operating Officer here at One Brooklyn Health. We posted for less than a week. We have 110 resumes. All right. So the competition is fierce. The number of positions are shrinking, and it makes it very difficult. All right. So the search process is really challenging, which means you got to be really good at it. Now, I told you I was going to differentiate between sort of a retained search firm and what would be called contingency recruitment. Contingency recruitment means that a health system has engaged a firm on a non-exclusive basis to find candidates for positions, and they get paid to the extent that they're successful in finding somebody. Retained search involves a much more formal partnership with a recruitment firm. That firm is paid up front for strategic and consultative search. And there's compensation at the back end to the extent that they do find a candidate, but it's a longer-term partnership between the retained search firm and the health system that has retained them. All right, and that long-term partnership is important to understand, because what that means is that the firm really makes an effort, the search firm really makes an effort to try to get to know what it is that the organization is truly looking for to fill out its the upper levels of its leadership team. All right, so they get more or less embedded in the organization. They really connect with the organization in order to understand the organization's culture, to understand the organization's needs, so that they really do find not just a person, but the right person for the job. Now, the typical recruitment process, all right, looks like this. It's pretty straightforward. The recruitment firms will do a needs assessment and prioritize what are the key attributes that the organization is looking for in a particular candidate for a particular role. All right. They, on the basis of that work and that assessment, they develop a prospectus. And anybody who's done executive search has seen the documents that are put together that describe the position, the responsibilities, they describe the organization, the minimum criteria and desired criteria for the candidate. And oftentimes they'll talk about next steps, and they'll give some indication and information about the organization. Now, a couple of important points about the prospectus. I mean, I've seen probably 100 of these over the course of my career. And I will tell you, if you're reading them, it's really important for you to understand what's being said and therefore what's not being said. I've developed a pretty good sense when I read about what I should expect coming into this interview process. So, for example, many times when organizations have financial challenges, there's not going to be a discussion about the finances of the organization in the prospectus. However, if the organization is doing well financially, that'll be said. Okay, so that's just one example. But if you don't see a discussion about the financial position of the organization, it is likely the case that that organization is challenged financially, and you should be aware of that going into your interview process. All right, this is one example. Candidate sourcing is then done based upon the prospectus that's been developed, and I'm sure many of you have received those letters from search firms that ask if you're interested in the position, and if you're not, if there are people that you can recommend. And that's part of the process that search firms use to identify potential candidates. Then there's some preliminary candidate screening that will occur, usually a phone call, all right, to give you an idea about who the candidates are. And it's sort of an initial determination on the part of the professionals from the search firm conducting the search about whether you should move forward as part of a number of people who will be presented to the organization to potentially ask to come in for an interview. So there'll be some initial screening on the part of the organization in conjunction with the search firm to get maybe 10 candidates, and they'll invite those candidates in as part of a panel interview or multiple panel interviews, and then you'll get to finalist selection. All right, so you might be a finalist in the process. When that happens, you're going to absolutely be invited to the organization. You're going to be asked to meet any number of people within the organization, because the organization is looking at feedback from its staff and from its board members in order to make a decision. There's a search that I was on where I was interviewed 6 times. I ultimately didn't get the position. I was interviewed 6 times, flown down to the city where the hospital was on numerous occasions. I met with board members. I met with senior leadership. I met with clinical chairs. And I was asked to do a town hall with staff where I was asked questions from all over the place. It was almost impossible to prepare for the town hall. So those are the kinds of things you might be asked to do as part of the process. Then if you win, right, you're nominated as the candidate. You begin a negotiation, and then ideally that negotiation leads to a contract. So now, some competencies that health systems value. All right. They all want, particularly for high level positions, people who can think strategically. So it's really important in your roles, even if you don't have the highest level roles, to not only think about your day-to-day work, all right, but really start to build strategic capabilities, all right. Really try to understand how your hospital approaches its strategy. You know, understand the healthcare market, the competitive landscape. These are all important pieces of information that you need to be able to answer higher level questions that are going to be asked of you if you're competing for executive roles. So it's very important to understand strategy and the tools of strategy, and it's important to understand how to think and communicate strategically about your organization and about the organization to which you're applying. They're going to want to see, you know, financial and operational acumen. Have you had experience financially? Have you had, oftentimes you're going to be asked, particularly if you're applying for an executive role, you're going to be asked questions about what's the largest P&L that you've had authority over. And, you know, they're going to ask you how you performed financially. So you have to be prepared to talk about that. 40% of hospitals lose money. So, you know, people who are applying for positions, more often than not, they've run hospitals that lost money. I've only ever been in safety net facilities. Even the hospital that I ran at Mount Sinai was the safety net hospital within Mount Sinai. So my hospitals, you know, a few years they make money, a lot of years they don't make money. So you've got to be able to explain when you haven't made money, what you've done. All right. You know, and have confidence in that, because anybody who's in healthcare does understand that, you know, different types of hospitals have different financial abilities to perform financially. They're also going to see operational acumen. What have you run? What have you transformed? What's working better today because of your intervention and involvement than was working previously? And they're going to want to see examples of these. They got people. The organizations are going to want to know that you've worked with physicians and how you've worked with physicians, and they're going to want to know, have you worked with unions? All right, you know, particularly if you're applying for jobs in this area, and they're going to want to see examples of how you've interacted and engaged with unions. Are you aligned with mission of your organization, and how do you approach culture? Okay, they're going to want to ask questions about that, and you know they're going to want to see that you approach quality or equity questions through the use of data. All right. You know, they're not going to want to just know anecdotally how you're doing, but they're going to want to know, for example, like on the quality side, they're going to want to know, what have you done as an administrator to help to improve quality or safety or experience? And again, the more you can quantify improvement, the better. Now, how do you position yourself? Well, you know, one thing you need to do, right, is you want to be able to articulate your brand and your career story. By articulating your brand, I mean, all right, what is it about you that is different than everybody else who's going to be competing for this role? All right, and how would you succinctly make that articulate that differentiation? Okay, that's easier said than done, but it's really, really important that you understand that and are able to communicate that. What do you do that's different from what everybody else does? Because if you can't articulate that difference, then you're not going to be able to convince people who are looking to source a highly competitive job that's highly compensated. You're not going to be able to convince them to give you the role. All right, you're just not. So you have to really, really understand that. What's different about you? Okay, you know, in my particular case, what I always like to talk about is the fact that my career arc took me from government to healthcare. So I had a significant background in health, in policy and politics, which helps if you're trying to run a complex health system, typically one that's a safety net because of how interdependent safety net facilities are on the government. So I like to talk about that. I like to talk about the fact that I've had a lead financial roles, in this case in the government, and that I bring that experience to bear in the job that I have. I like to talk about the fact that I've done, in every role that I've done significant and successful turnaround work. And I try to point that out. I then like to talk about how as I've shifted into healthcare, how the roles and responsibilities that I've had have really led to the ability to a demonstrated ability to transform healthcare institutions that are challenging financially and serve a vulnerable population into ones that demonstrate that even in that context, we're able to deliver better care, safer care, and a better experience to the patients that are in the communities that we serve that, again, are highly vulnerable and that really need our help. And I'm able to demonstrate, again, in a track record of being able to do that. So you have to, sort of put together your narrative and your career story so that it makes sense. All right. So, sometimes there are gaps in your career. You need to have a narrative that explains those gaps. Perhaps you've moved from one career to another. You need to have a narrative that explains that movement. Perhaps you've gone through a number of different jobs, right? So you've only been at positions for a short period of time. For some people, that's an issue. So you need to be able to take that head on and narrate that. You need to try to show also that everything that you've done previously connects you to this job. Like everything you've done, it's all a pathway to the job for which you're applying, right? You want to demonstrate how you lead in the roles that you've held. All right. You're always going to be asked those questions. And in fact, you're going to be asked questions about where you've done things wrong. Have an answer for that. All right. I have an answer for that. When I speak about mistakes that I've made, I tell a story about staffing in the wake of the first wave of COVID, and where we leaned too heavily on keeping the staffing tight because the finances of the hospital were so damaged by COVID. But that had deleterious effects. And I remember in my role at Mount Sinai Morningside having to acknowledge that I had made a mistake and reverse course. And I tell that story frequently because I think it's important that in leadership positions, if we're truly going to be servant leaders and humble and exercise humility, you've got to be able to tell clearly and articulately stories about where you've made mistakes, and you need to own them. All right. Don't be afraid of that in the context of an interview. People doing the interview will give you credit for that level of honesty and transparency. You want to show measurable results, again, without exaggerating, and try to quantify your successes and make sure that anything you do say numerically, that you can source it. Because you may be asked that, say, boy, that's really interesting that you're able to drive patient experience up by 10 top box points. Could you show me the data for that? I'd really like to learn what you did. You're going to have the backup information for any claims that you make. And you want to align your personal narrative to mission, to community, and to strategic priorities. Now, your resume and your digital presence, right? Everybody's got an online presence at this point. So you want to make sure your resume is in an executive format with a focus on results and on metrics. And you want to have a professionally drawn up biography. You want to highlight your leadership, your transformation work, and your results, right? You want your LinkedIn profile optimized for recruiter search, and there are tips that you can get online for how to do that. and you want to know your digital profile. All right. I was asked once in a interview for an executive position about a tweet that I had authored, I think probably 10 years ago. I didn't even remember the tweet. I actually don't think I authored it. But I had to scramble and do some homework. So the lesson learned there, all right, is before you embark on a search, just search yourself, right? Look at your, Twitter history or your X history. Look at your LinkedIn history. Look at your Facebook profile and postings, and just see if there's anything there that somebody might pick up that you might have to explain. And, is there anything there that frankly you want to just get rid of before you start the search process? All right. Not that you don't leave a footprint, but, do the best that you can. But the bottom line is at least know what's out there. All right. Because the search firms, if you're going for a high level position, they will do their homework on you and they will ask you questions about things that you posted that in retrospect you may not be that proud of. Networking and visibility. You want to build long-term recruiter relationships. I know a number of different recruiters. Again, I've only been successful once, so I know a number of different recruiters with whom I've not succeeded, but I built relationships with them over time. I've actually been called, I don't want to name the firm or the position, but I've been called by a firm, again, that didn't even have a successful placement for me, but I had participated in enough searches that they really liked me as a candidate. And I've been called about other searches, confidentially about other searches, to give my views or my input, about the roles that they were recruiting for. That's, you've reached a level of trust when they do that. That's important to develop, because you want the recruiters to in the best that they can advocate for you. Now remember, and I didn't say this earlier, remember, the reality is that retained search firms are not retained by you. They are retained by the company or the organization that is doing the search. So you are not their client. That company is the client. All right. Now, good people who do searches well serve their client, but they also manage the relationships with the candidates. But just understand that dynamic, that you are not technically speaking the client of the recruitment firm. You want to engage in your various professional associations. Okay, that's really important. Be visible, go to conferences, participate in webinars like this. Again, that increases visibility. It shows that you have a professional commitment. You want to be a thought leader. All right, join panels, put stuff on LinkedIn, respond to posts on LinkedIn, write white papers where appropriate, position yourself out there as somebody that people in the industry go to. All right. As that's, I think, very important, because the word gets out about that. And then you want to build your board or your physician or your civic relationships as well, right? What organizations are you on a board for? How are you volunteering? What community work do you do, et cetera? So you want to be a well-rounded individual who's actively networking and engaging with other professionals within your industry. Now, let's say you find a position you want to apply for, and you apply and you get an initial screening interview, right? An initial call with the recruiter. So when that happens, before you take that call, read the position prospectus. They're telling you the kinds of things that the organization is looking for. All right. Usually they're going to tell you, 10 or 15 things that the organization is looking for from a candidate. It's very difficult to remember all of that when you're interviewing. Focus on a few of them. All right. And be ready to speak to them when the time is appropriate in your interview, because that demonstrates that you actually read the material, right? And it demonstrates that you're trying to think about how you can best fill the position that they're looking to fill and what you uniquely bring to the position. You want to answer concisely. Okay, I have to train myself to do this. Sometimes you like to go right into the explanation, right? How many of us do that? And when we do that, the problem is that you lose the listener. All right, they said, well, wait a minute, what's your answer? All right, so if you are, asked a question, try to give a concise response right up front before there's any explanation. Yes, no, um, whatever the concise response needs to be, and then you can explain. But you've already answered the question. All right, so it's very important. Respond concisely, explain, and then come back to the response. All right, use examples and metrics as best you can. I have a sort of a mental Rolodex, if anybody remembers the term Rolodex. I like a mental Rolodex of examples that I use in a number of different settings to try to illustrate points that I'm making. All right, have that mental Rolodex at the ready when you're there to interview. You want to demonstrate leadership maturity and readiness. You want to connect your background and experience to the needs articulated in the prospectus. All right, make those connections for the listener. And then at the end of the interview, you want to ask thoughtful questions about strategy and culture and the priorities of the organization. What you don't want to do on the initial screening call, unless they ask you, is you don't want to start asking about compensation. Not then. If they ask you about compensation, you can certainly respond. All right, but it's not something that I would bring up at that point. Now, if you make it through that, all right, you're going to get to some kind of executive panel interview. All right. And so again, here you want to have at the ready examples of how you turned an organization around, how you enhance culture, how you interact with unions, how you do capital planning, budgeting. Have examples at the ready of all of these types of things that are likely subject to questions, because you don't want to be sort of mentally scrambling for those examples while you're doing the interview. You want to show clarity of thought and vision. Again, if you're asked a question, respond concisely, explain, and then respond again. You want to, again, listen deeply, answer crisply, directly, and succinctly, and passionately. All right. People aren't going to remember everything that you said in the interview, but they will get a vibe from you, right? They are going to get a feel. So you want to convey your passion for the work that you do and for the job for which you're applying. All right. Now you can be humorous as well, but I think passion is really important. And you want to demonstrate and walk a fine line between humility and confidence. You want to give examples and stories about maybe where you fell short. You want to demonstrate in your answers that you're a servant leader, that you're humble, but you also want to convey confidence in how you answer the questions. So confidentiality and references, as best as possible, you want to protect your confidentiality. If you're in a job currently, if you're not, and confidentiality isn't as important, then that's fine. Convey that up front to the recruiter. The recruiter's bias will be that they're going to protect your confidentiality, but if that is something that's important to you, say that to them so that they know. Now, when you choose your references, okay, this is where the work in cultivating your network is so important, because you want to be thoughtful about your references. All right, you want to think about, you may get guidance from the search firm. The search firm may say, we want to hear from a couple of people who worked for you, and we want to hear from a couple of people who were your colleagues, and we want to hear from a couple of people who were your bosses. Okay, so those are your parameters. You got to work with those parameters, but you also, if you have some flexibility, you want to be thinking about, okay. where do I think I need to shore things up? All right, where do I need somebody to vouch for me? So I'll give you an example. Prior to taking the role that I have here, I worked within systems, but when I ran a hospital, I ran a single hospital. And that was sometimes used against me in the search process, that it became something that was very difficult to overcome. So, one of the things that I would do in the reference component of the process, I would have in this case, it was my former, a former boss, talk about how he was completely confident that if I had a system role, moving into the system role would be fine. That there were actually examples of system work that I had done at this particular job, and he could point to them. All right, this is one example, but you want to think about where you got to shore some stuff up, right? And you want to think about, maybe who can really underscore a key point that you're trying to drive home. And then, when you meet with your references, you want to, you before they talk to the search firm, if you can, and if you can meet with them, give them key points that you want them to drive home. All right, so that they, they do the best job that they can for you. Negotiating strategies, you want to research your benchmarks, right? You want to know, like, what's a reasonable comp level to be searching for. You want to discuss the total package, your base, your incentive, your benefits, your retirement, any relocation expenses, what are the termination provisions, and your severance, amongst other provisions. All right, so don't only focus on, like, what are you getting paid every 2 weeks or every month. You want to focus on all these other things because they have an impact. All right. You want to clarify the performance expectations and the evaluation cycle, how your performance is to be evaluated and how it's connected to any incentives. You want to be really clear about that. Some places are looser about evaluations. Some places are extremely disciplined about evaluations. You need to know that, and you need to have the appropriate clarity and protections built into your agreement. And you want to negotiate with professionalism and respect. You may get told no a lot in terms of the things that you ask for. You have to decide, how important those provisions are. And sometimes, particularly if you're using a lawyer, you need to know when, in the end, you got to say pencils down. I in the most recent search I was in, it was a little bit contentious between the lawyers and the organization. And again, I had a very good relationship with the person running the search. And at one point in time, the person running the search, called me up and said, listen, my recommendation to you is we need to end this at this point. All right. That you want to not create a problem. And, she was giving good advice, and I took it, and that's how the negotiations concluded. Now, onboarding in your first 90 days, all right, you likely want to go on some kind of listening tour, be out there, be visible, be present. Sometimes you can't do that. In my current role, I've had limitations on that because we've got just a massively burning platform. But in an ideal world, you do that. You want to speak to your board. You want to speak to the medical staff. You want to get an understanding of the culture, and you want to figure out how to build trust. You want to identify ways of securing some early wins. Early wins are really important. All right. Even if they're easy, basic wins, you want to be able to demonstrate efficacy and effectiveness. One of the first things I do is get something painted. All right. So here at One Brooklyn Health, at Brookdale Hospital, if you look in the lobby's being painted. People see that the lobby's being painted. It sends a signal that stuff is getting, starting to happen. Okay. And the communication rhythm, when can people expect to hear from you? And then you want to align your strategic priorities, and you want to determine ultimately, based on all of this, what are the areas you're going to focus on? Because coming out of your first 90 days, you really need to know what are the areas that you need to focus on for success. Some common pitfalls in the search process is speaking only tactically, so not being strategic enough, right? You don't have a good sense of the culture of the organization, and you're a little bit ego driven, right? Because that comes across, and particularly if you're meeting with a board, they don't usually like to hear that. Failure to prepare presentation. In one of the roles for which I competed against a person who just showed up, in a board interview. No presentation, was just talking off the cuff. That's a sure way not to get the job. So, take the time to prepare a presentation. An unwillingness to be bold. In my mind, particularly if the competition is fierce, say something that's bold. Now, you could say something that's bold that says it sends a signal to the board or whoever's interviewing that, oh man, we don't want this person. But you know what? I think if you're up there in the batter, using the baseball analogy since the World Series just ended, if you're up there in the batter's box and the game is on the line, which it often is here, you swing and you swing to win the game. All right. And the way you swing to win the game is sometimes you got to be bold. A lack of humility or over-rehearsed answers. All right, you want to prep, but you don't want to have like written out answers. You need to speak confidently and engage the members of your board of the team that's interviewing you, and don't discuss compensation too quickly. There will be a time and a place to do that. Just some tips on long-term career strategy. Get an executive coach. Here at One Brooklyn, I'm pleased to say that our board actually invested in a coach for myself and the CEO, which I think is fantastic. It's a best practice. Get on boards. All right, have the governance experience in addition to administrative or executive experience. You want to maintain your industry presence. Once you secure the job, you don't want to disappear. Maintain your industry presence so that people see you again continuously as a thought leader. You want to help colleagues. Now that you're in a position, you've secured your position, trust me when I tell you from experience, there's a lot of folks out there that need help to secure roles. Help them, all right? And you want to manage your brand intentionally, okay? You want people to think certain things about you, and so do that, design that, cultivate that with intention. And then last is some key takeaways. One, understand the vulnerabilities in the current market. It is freaking hard. The amount of competition for a limited number of jobs is fierce. So you need to understand that you've got to be on your A game. You want to establish and cultivate a presence in the industry and online with intentionality. Like, what is that presence that you want? You want to build relationship with industry search leaders so they see you as somebody to go to, as a potential candidate, and that they may contact you for references for other candidates or advice. Approach the search interview process strategically and do not be afraid to be bold. As I said, you're competing fiercely for a limited number of positions. You need to stand out. Being bold helps you to stand out. There's a risk associated with that, but sometimes that's what you need to do. You want to cultivate your network for referrals and for references. Negotiate intelligently and intentionally. Have a plan for success when you walk in the door. And realize that the higher up you are, the longer the process may be. If you're in a search for a COO or a CEO job, I'm telling you, count on 2 years. Count on 2 years. So you've got to think accordingly. You've got to have your own personal financial plan. If you're in between jobs, you've got to understand that this process is going to take time. You don't want to get anxious or frustrated. You have to be realistic about how long things are going to take. All right. And with that, I will conclude. I will stop sharing my screen. And I'm happy to take any questions. Darren, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Art. We're so grateful for that presentation this morning. If there's no other questions for Art, we're going to move into our closing remarks with Helene. But before that, I just want to make sure, does anyone else have any questions related to how to navigate through the executive search process, or any other questions for Art related to various processes and advancing your careers?
So there appear to be a number in the chat, Darren.
Sorry, Art, I'll read it for you. Any
Okay.
advice specifically for CMO roles?
So I think CMO roles, there's a, I don't want to say the search process is easier because that's not fair, but I want to say that, you know, organizations are looking for physician leaders. So I think there are greater opportunities for physician leaders, including in CMO positions. And there are less people who are going to be eligible for those positions because you need to have a medical background. I would say advice for CMOs is shore up on the administrative part of your work. Because what people are going to be looking for is, can you lead other doctors? Do you have examples of leadership within your current or prior organizations? And that leadership can be administrative leadership, or that leadership can be within a clinical department. Those are the kinds of roles, prior roles, that organizations are going to look to see in order to be able to potentially put you in a CMO position. So you're gonna want to really shore up your background in either of those areas.
Thank you, Art. The next question is, you've mentioned staying relevant with publications. What sources would you recommend?
Yeah, so what I do a few things. So number one, there's a number of thought leaders that I follow on LinkedIn, where I'm able to get a lot of information really at my fingertips from a variety of different sources. So LinkedIn can be a really valuable way to do that. I would say second, anything from the advisory board. So even if your organization doesn't participate in the advisory board company, you can listen to podcasts on radio advisory. Those podcasts are excellent, and I would highly recommend those. And third, I think there are certain. Well, actually, the third thing I'm going to say is that honestly, I find teaching to really help me or force me to do the homework that I need to do to be able to explain things to people. So that keeps me connected with relevant literature. So those would be the three areas that I would look at to try to stay up on information that's out there.
Thank you, Art. What do you do if you're referenced retired? So in terms of references, what would you do if that person had retired?
So first of all, you can always ask somebody who's retired if they're willing to write a reference for you. They can indicate that they've retired on in the reference that they write, or in how they communicate to the search firm. Because really, all the search firm is really looking for is, how do you know them? So obviously, that person knows you from when they were still in the industry. So I think retire. I've actually used people who have retired as references. So I don't see that as actually problematic. I would look to balance that out with somebody who is in the industry. But if somebody who's retired can really knows you and can give you the kind of reference that you're looking for, I think you utilize that person if they're willing to help you.
Thank you, Art. Another question, how do you overcome the search firm pigeonholing you in your current industry sector if you want to make a switch or a transition between industry sectors?
Yeah, extremely hard. So I don't want to. I don't want to give any illusions or false hope. That's very hard. Search firms by nature tend to be conservative. All right. They tend to want to give recommendations to a board that are going to be within lanes. All right. It's much easier in a competitive environment for a search firm to recommend, for example, somebody as a chief operating officer who has been a chief operating officer, who has been a VP for operations in a health system or hospital previously, as opposed to somebody who might have run operations in the financial services sector or some other sector as a startup, and you're trying to make your way over here. What I would suggest is I think you have to do two things. You want to look for jobs where they're specifically looking for people, a broader array of people. Some health systems want to get people who are not from the industry. All right, that's actually part of their goal. So you should look for organizations that are willing to do that. Number one, and number two, if you're not applying for that kind of a job, what you want to do is you want to connect what you've done to the work that would need to be done if you were to make the transition. But I don't want to pretend it's anything other than extremely difficult to do that.
Thank you. There's about, I think, 4 to 6 more questions, just letting you know. And then team, we are coming closer to time, but I will get your questions out there for Art. How do you make your relationships with executive search firms, staff, before you need them?
It's an iterative process, meaning you participate in searches. Okay, there are instances where I participated in searches, figuring I wasn't going to get a particular role. I didn't really say this, and probably should have, but I would say that if you're going to undertake a search process, you actually want to participate in searches that you're not that are not necessarily the top ones, because you actually need to practice. You need to go through the process of doing the search work, talking to people, making the case for yourself, answering questions. But in the process of doing that, that's how you build relationships, and then it becomes iterative.
A question actually in the other chat that I thought was great. How do you motivate yourself when you do not get a role you thought you'd be a good fit for, and you felt that overall the interview process was going well?
That has happened to me probably a dozen times in my career, and that's not an exaggeration. The way you motivate yourself is you have to tell yourself that, not securing a search, not winning a search is 95% of the time, it's not about you. All right. You may have done fantastic, but it's just about whatever it is that the organization is looking for. Okay. I found out once that I didn't get a CEO job in a press release. Like, I didn't even get the call from the search firm. I saw it in a press release. No joke. I'd done 6 interviews for this job, and that's what ended up happening. So, I mean, you can't get more discouraging than that, right? But you really have to just recognize that you just got to go on to the next one. And then think about other industries as well. Just keep things in mind like this. Again, using my baseball analogy, a good hitter in baseball fails 7 out of 10 times. All right. If you work for an investment bank, you're going to be successful 10% of the time. 90% of the time, you're going to fail. You're not going to get the job. So everything you do has high chance of failure or high chance of a miss. And you have to realize search is no different. And you have to, do the Jay-Z thing, dust yourself off, and you gotta move on.
Awesome, Art. And just quickly, the 2 other questions. What do you do if your title is not an executive level, but you have those responsibilities? How do you position yourself within that search? And then the second question is, what type of length should your executive resume be when you're looking into a search?
So I think to answer the first question, you're going to have to make the executive stuff that you're doing pop when you explain the role. All right. So in how you explain the role in your resume, and how you present the role in your bio, and how you talk about yourself, you're going to have to lean heavily into the executive components of what it is that you do. And when you interview, you can even say, look, this is my title, but you know what? Put that aside. Here's what I do, and you go right to it. And so that's the best that you can do. It's the honest way to approach it. Have your references back you up. All right. And that's the way to go about it. The other question quickly, Darren?
Length of a
Oh,
resume.
yeah, I mean, look, it depends on, honestly, it depends on how, how long you've been doing work, right? My resume is, I think, 5 pages. It can be less than that, but, at my age, it's gonna have to be at a minimum like 3, because just to cover everything. If you're younger, right, or less experienced, maybe 2 to 3 or something like that. But I'm less worried about that. Tell the story that you want to tell. All right. What I try to do in my resume is I try to take stuff out that I don't think tells the story anymore. I'm trying to create a narrative and use the resume to buttress that.
Got it. And now, Art, 2 other questions, and then we'll move to Halim, our president-elect, to close this out. How do you make time to make it not noticeable to your existing employer that you are a part of research? That's one question. And then the other question is the pros and cons of outplacement services.
Yeah. On the outplacement services, I have to be honest with you and say I've never used them. And so I don't want to comment on something that I don't have direct knowledge on. So because I don't think I'd be doing it proper justice. On the other question, I mean, look, you have accumulated days off, right? You may have to take some of the time in order to be able to participate in a search, as an example. If you had to do an interview during the day, do it on your lunch break. Things like that. You have to be careful, right? You want to be careful. You don't want to be obvious. And those would be the two things that I've done and I would do. Also, be intelligent about, don't put it so obviously on your calendar either. If you have a calendar in the office, for example, just be careful there.
Art, thank you so much. In terms of some of the additional questions related to executive search, and the processes and the resources, please feel free to reach out to Art, of course, as our regent and as a leader in the market. And then also, Hilney has incredible sponsors for Healthcare Leaders of New York, who are recruitment firms and HR specialists. So please go to the Hilney website, look at those sponsors, and tap into those resources as members. They can help you. Halim, closing remarks is yours. Halim is our president-elect for Healthcare Leaders of New York.
Thank you, Darren. One thing about this, you would initially look at the title of this presentation and you think it would apply to only executives, but everything that Art brought forth to us today can be applied for every level of your career. It could be applicable to the early careerist. It could be applicable to the senior level executive, the middle manager. Everybody should be able to walk away from today's session with some valuable pieces of information to take with them as they continue to advance and progress within their career. So once again, we'd like to thank our ACHE Regent, Arthur Gianelli, for taking time out of his busy day to spend with our membership and everybody in attendance today. Thank you once again, Art. Next slide,
Thank
please.
you.
As a reminder to everybody, this is a self-reporting event, so be sure that after you complete today's event, that you go to your ACHE website, go to my ACHE, and be sure to report this as 1.0 ACHE qualifying education credits. You are responsible for that. ACHE nor the chapter will report this to them on your behalf. Next slide, please. As Darren was mentioning, this event and all of our other events are brought to us with the generous support of our sponsors. So without their support and their help for advancing healthcare leadership, we would not be able to bring these types of events to the membership and everybody in attendance. So once again, we'd like to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors for their generous support in advancing healthcare leadership. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in becoming a sponsor, you can reach out to our sponsorship committee at sponsors@hlny.org. Next slide, please. Be sure to go to our website and subscribe to our calendar. Our next upcoming events start with our Lean Six Sigma series with the Green Belt on November 10th. And then we have our second part in our installation of Coffee with the Chiefs on shifting priorities, led by Calandra Branch. That will be November 18th. 2 weeks from today, we will have our annual Frank Camerano Memorial Dinner and Lecture at St. John's University, moderated by Mr. Fred Skanga, who is the Executive Director of the Long Island State Vets Home. And then we hope to wrap up our year with our annual holiday party at Terrace on the Park on December 2nd. Once again, be sure to go to hlny.org and register for these upcoming events. Next slide, please. Next slide, we spoke about that. The Foundation for HLNY Scholarship Programs, also, we're looking to promote the scholarships that we have available in conjunction with the foundation. They take the lead on ensuring that they are stewards for these scholarships. Art himself has the ACHE Congress Scholarship coming up with the deadline approaching within the next 4 days. This is where the Gianelli ACHE Congress Scholarship pays for up to $2,500 towards the ACHE Congress registration, and you're able to get a mentoring session with Mr. Gianelli as well. Take note of it and be sure to take a look at our website as we continue to announce upcoming scholarships as they become available. Next slide, please. Once again, we'd like to thank you for joining us, and be sure to follow us on all of our social media platforms. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us by going to membership@hlny.org, and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. And be sure to take note of our videos, which this video will also be available on our YouTube channel as well. Next slide, please. That is it. Everybody have a good day. Thank you once again, Art. Darren, have a good day, everybody. Take care. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.